science will undergo a reflowering, a renaissance. I think we're at a place where we definitely need it. All right, welcome back to the party, everybody. I am your host, Lutch, aka the Indian Jesus, here to resurrect the second coming of common sense. Let's party. So 2013, let's go back about 10 years. There was a TED Talk that was given and seemed to be received pretty well, but a couple months later, it was taken down. But I've got it right here for you. So Rick quickly just says, on January 12, 2013, Rupert Sheldrake gave a following TED Talk. The name of the talk was Visions for Transition, Challenging Existing Paradigms and Redefining Values. On March 14th, 2013, so it's just about 2 months later, TED removed the talk and released a brief statement, quote, "We feel responsibility not to provide a platform for talks which appear to have crossed the line into pseudoscience." So before we get into this, dogmatic thinking. How often am I constantly talking about dogmatic thinking? And usually, especially as an atheist, I'm attacking the church, I'm attacking belief in God, miracles, any kind of stuff like that. But we've seen much more recently how dogmatic thinking on the other side can be not only as bad, but possibly even worse. So let's check this out and you'll see exactly what I mean.
The science delusion is the belief that science already understands the nature of reality in principle, leaving only the details to be filled in. This is a very widespread belief in our society. It's the kind of belief system of people who say, "I don't believe in God, I believe in science."
Now, I was somebody who would be perfectly fine with this statement a few years ago. I don't believe in God, I believe in science. The problem is that science is a method. Science is not an answer. And this is what they're going to dive into.
It's a belief system which has now been spread to the entire world. But there's a conflict in the heart of science between science as a method of inquiry based on reason, evidence, hypothesis, and collective investigation, and science as a belief system or a worldview.
Exactly.
And unfortunately, the worldview aspect of science has come to inhibit and constrict the free inquiry, which is the very lifeblood of the scientific endeavor.
The worldview aspect of science has come to inhibit and constrict the free inquiry, which is the lifeblood of scientific endeavor. This is exactly what I mean. That treating science or scientists in the same way that we would treat the church or the priests is not any better.
Since the late 19th century, science has been conducted under the aspect of a belief system or worldview, which is essentially that of materialism, philosophical materialism. And these sciences are now wholly owned subsidiaries of the materialist worldview. I think that as we break out of it, the sciences will be regenerated. What I do in my book, The Science Delusion, which is called Science Set Free in the United States.
And that's a play on Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, which hugely influential as to an atheist like myself. But again, I think too many people who read that book went too far in the other direction.
Is take the 10 dogmas or assumptions of science and turn them into questions, seeing how well they stand up if you look at them scientifically.
So that's what we want to look at, the 10 dogmatic assumptions of science that people seem to take as not science, not question, but dogma.
None of them stand up very well. What I'm going to do is first run through what these 10 dogmas are, and then I'll only have time to discuss one or two of them in a bit more detail. But essentially, the 10 dogmas, which are the default worldview of most educated people all over the world, are first, that nature is mechanical or machine-like. The universe is like a machine, animals and plants are like machines, we're like machines. In fact, we are machines. We're lumbering robots, in Richard Dawkins' vivid phrase, with brains that are genetically programmed computers.
Now, again, I'm not saying any of these things are inherently wrong. This is just the dogmatic assumptions that people accept that is the end of the line. Now, I am a materialist. I don't think there's anything in the universe that isn't made out of stuff. But I could be very wrong about that. I just don't have the right information yet. The problem is when you have determined you know all there is to know. As long as you're still open to change your mind, as long as you're still open to new information, then we're all good. Because a lot of these things I agree with.
Second, matter is unconscious. The whole universe is made up of unconscious matter. There's no consciousness in stars, in galaxies, in planets, in animals, in plants. And there ought not to be any in us either, if this theory is true. So a lot of the philosophy of mind over the last 100 years is trying to prove that we're not really conscious at all.
And people laugh, but that's actually not, I mean, he's dead serious in the sense that we meaning humans, are at the point of trying to discover what exactly is consciousness. And it may very well be an illusion that our brain plays on us. And, you know, that's a whole other conversation. But again, we haven't found all the answers yet. So saying that it's settled science is wrong.
So the matter's unconscious, then the laws of nature are fixed. This is dogma 3. The laws of nature are the same now as they were at the time of the Big Bang, and they'll be the same forever. Not just the laws, but the constants of nature are fixed, which is why they're called constants. Dogma 4, the total amount of matter and energy is always the same. It never changes in total quantity, except at the moment of the Big Bang, when it all sprang into existence from nowhere in a single instant.
And once again, I 100% believe that is the case. But I have no reason to believe that it cannot change. They say matter is never created or destroyed. It just changes from one form to another. And that makes sense to me. But we still also have the question of where did all of this matter and energy come from in the first place? It's okay. We don't have to have an answer. That's good. We don't have an answer yet.
The fifth dogma is that nature is purposeless. There are no purposes in all nature, and the evolutionary process has no purpose or direction. Dogma 6.
So real quick, just on dogma 5, nature is purposeless, doesn't mean that you have no purpose that you can give to yourself, but that there's no inherent purpose. Similar to what a religious person would think that their purpose for being here is to follow God or God's word or whatever. The scientific dogma is that that cannot exist. There cannot be some inherent meaning to existence.
The biological heredity is material. Everything you inherit is in your genes, or in epigenetic modifications of the genes, or in cytoplasmic inheritance. It's material. Dogma 7, memories are stored inside your brain as material traces. Somehow everything you remember is in your brain in modified nerve endings, phosphorylated proteins. No one knows how it works, but nevertheless, almost everyone in the scientific world believes it must be in the brain. Dogma 8, your mind is inside your head. All your consciousness is the activity of your brain and nothing more. Dogma 9, which follows from dogma 8, psychic phenomena like telepathy are impossible. Your thoughts and intentions cannot have any effect at a distance because your mind's inside your head.
This is the first dogma that he's listing that I'm not wholly on board with, because psychic phenomenon and like telepathy, I have no evidence that that's ever been done, but I certainly have no evidence that it's impossible. And so to determine something to be impossible before we have the evidence to say that's impossible is scientism.
Therefore, all the apparent evidence for telepathy and other psychic phenomena is illusory. People believe these things happen, but it's just because they don't know enough about statistics, or they're deceived by coincidences, or it's wishful thinking. And dogma 10, mechanistic medicine is the only kind that really works. That's why governments only fund research into mechanistic medicine.
This is in opposition to like Eastern medicine or Reiki and stuff like that.
And ignore complementary and alternative therapies. Those can't possibly really work because they're not mechanistic. They may appear to work because people would have got better anyway, or because of the placebo effect. But the only kind that really works is mechanistic medicine.
And this is one of the ones I probably would have been most on top of until everything that happened in the last 3 years. It's really made me realize that we approach this stuff dogmatically. We just assume that whatever the doctors say is right, whatever the government says is right. Nope.
Well, this is the default worldview, which is held by almost all educated people all over the world. It's the basis of the educational system, the National Health Service, the Medical Research Council, governments, and it's just the default worldview of educated people. But I think every one of these dogmas is very, very questionable. And when you look at it, they fall apart. I'm going to take first the idea that the laws of nature are fixed. This is a hangover from an older worldview. Before the 1960s, when the Big Bang Theory came in, people thought that the whole universe was eternal, governed by eternal mathematical laws. When the Big Bang came in, then that assumption continued, even though the Big Bang revealed a universe that's radically evolutionary, about 14 billion years old, growing and developing and evolving for 14 billion years, growing and cooling, and more structures and patterns appear within it. But the idea is all the laws of nature were completely fixed at the moment of the Big Bang, like a cosmic Napoleonic code.
And the reason we think that is because all evidence points towards it. That's not the point. That's not the point. The point is not looking at this stuff as dogma.
As my friend Terence McKenna used to say, modern
Shout
science
out
is
to
based on the
Terence
principle,
McKenna.
give us one free miracle and we'll explain the rest. And the one free miracle is the appearance of all the matter and energy in the universe and all the laws that govern it from nothing in a single instant. Well, in an evolutionary universe, why shouldn't the laws themselves evolve? After all, human laws do, and the idea of laws of nature is based on a metaphor with human laws. It's a very anthropocentric metaphor. Only humans have laws. In fact, only civilized societies have laws.
Right.
As C.S. Lewis once said, to say that a stone falls to earth because it's obeying a law makes it a man and even a citizen. It's a metaphor that we got so used to, we forget it's a metaphor.
Okay, well, at least he understands that it's a metaphor and that it's not actually the same thing as legislation.
In an evolving universe, I think a much better idea is the idea of habits. I think the habits of nature evolve. The regularities of nature are essentially habitual. This was an idea put forward at the beginning of the 20th century by the American philosopher C.S. Peirce. And it's an idea which various other philosophers have entertained, and it's one which I myself have developed into a scientific hypothesis, the hypothesis of morphic resonance, which is the basis of these evolving habits.
Morphic morphic resonance.
According to this hypothesis, everything in nature has a kind of collective memory. Resonance occurs on the basis of similarity. As a young giraffe embryo grows in its mother's womb, it tunes in to the morphic resonance of previous giraffes. It draws on that collective memory. It grows like a giraffe and it behaves like a giraffe because it's drawing on this collective memory. It has to have the right genes to make the right proteins. But genes, in my view, are grossly overrated. They only account for the proteins that the organism can make, not the shape or the form or the behavior. Every species has a kind of collective memory. Even crystals do. This theory predicts that if you make a new kind of crystal for the first time, the very first time you make it, it won't have an existing habit. But once it crystallizes, then the next time you make it, there'll be an influence from the first crystals to the second ones all over the world by morphic resonance. It'll crystallize a bit easier.
I don't think that that's the same thing as a habit in the way that we use the word. He's talking about habits and how we learn from past generations. But that's not the same thing as a molecule and how molecules act. So you're losing me a little bit here, buddy.
The third time, there'll be an influence from the first and second crystals. There is, in fact, good evidence that new compounds get easier to crystallize all around the world, just as this theory would predict. It also predicts that if you train animals to learn a new trick, for example, rats learn a new trick in London, then all around the world, rats of the same breed should learn the same trick quicker just because the rats have learned it here. And surprisingly, there's already evidence that this actually happens.
Really? So again, that's the idea that these things work a certain way. And if they already study this, and that's the case, then obviously my previous notions of what was true were wrong.
Anyway, that's my own hypothesis in a nutshell of morphic resonance. Everything depends on evolving habits, not on fixed laws. But I want to spend a few moments on the constants of nature too, because these are, again, assumed to be constant. Things like the gravitational constant, the speed of light, are called the fundamental constants. Are they really constant? Well, when I got interested in this question, I tried to find out. They're given in physics handbooks. Handbooks of physics list the existing fundamental constants, tell you their value. But I wanted to see if they'd changed. So I got the old volumes of physical handbooks. I went to the Patent Office Library here in London, and they're the only place I could find that kept the old volumes. Normally people throw them away when the new values come out. They throw away the old ones. When I did this, I found that the speed of light dropped between 1928 and 1945 by about 20 kilometers per second.
Did it drop? My immediate assumption would be that that would have something to do with how we were measuring the speed of light and not the speed of light itself. But let's see.
It's a huge drop because they're given with errors of only fractions of decimal points of error. And yet, all over the world, it dropped, and they were all getting values very similar to each other with tiny errors. And then in 1945, it went up, 48, it went up again. And then people started getting very similar values again. I was very intrigued by this, and I couldn't make sense of it. So I went to see the head of metrology at the National Physical Laboratory in Teddington. Metrology is the science in which people measure constants. And I asked him about this. I said, what do you make of this drop in the speed of light between 1928 and 1945? And he said, oh dear, he said, you've uncovered the most embarrassing episode in the history of our science. So I said, well, could the speed of light have actually dropped? And that would have amazing implications if so. He said, no, of course it couldn't have actually dropped. It's a constant.
There it is. There it is. That dogmatic thinking. That even I would say, oh, it's a constant. It had to be different. But he's pointing out the exact same thing that I just had, and it seems silly when it's drawn out like this, doesn't it? If we know that the scientific method is accurate, and then all over the world, these measurements experienced a similar change of degree than to just brush it off as, must be this, must be that. That's the same as the God of the gaps argument. It's just the other way around.
So, well then how do you explain the fact everyone was finding it going much slower during that period? Is it because they were fudging their results to get what they thought other people should be getting, and the whole thing was just produced in the minds of physicists? We don't like to use the word fudge. I said, well, what do you prefer? He said, well, we prefer to call it intellectual phase locking. So I said, well, if it was going on then, how can we be so sure it's not going on today? And that the present values are produced by intellectual phase locking. And he said, oh, we know that's not the case. I said, how do we know? He said, we've solved the problem. And I said, well, how? He said, well, we fixed the speed of light by definition in 1972.
Kind of like how Dr. Fauci changed the definition of gain of that thing. Or now they're using, according to the Jordan dude from the Project Veritas video, they're using directed evolution. So now you haven't actually figured out why the dip occurred. You've just eliminated the problem by semantic obfuscation.
So I said, but it might still change. You said, yes, but we'd never know it because we've defined the meter in terms of the speed of light. So the units had changed with it. So he looked very pleased about that. They'd fixed that problem. But I said, well, then what about big G, the gravitational constant, known in the trade as big G? It's written with a capital G, Newton's universal gravitational constant. That's varied by more than 1.3% in recent years. And it seems to vary from place to place and from time to time. And he said, oh, well, those are just errors. And unfortunately, there are quite big errors with big G. So I said, well, what if it's really changing? I mean, perhaps it is really changing. And then I looked at how they do it. What happens is they measure it in different labs. They get different values on different days, and then they average them. And then other labs around the world do the same, and they come out usually with a rather different average. And then the International Committee on Metrology meets every 10 years or so and average the ones from labs around the world to come up with the value of big G. But what if G were actually fluctuating? What if it changed? There's already evidence, actually, that it changes throughout the day and throughout the year.
So we're seeing the evidence that it's there, but because we've called it a constant, because we've called the gravitational constant a constant, there is a dogmatic reason to ignore evidence just to keep our narrative intact. Now, I want you to remember, the reason that I'm bringing this to you is because this was a banned TED Talk. TED Talks took this down because they were talking about misinformation. I have not heard one claim made about the laws or constants of science. All he's doing here is asking questions. They're legitimate questions. Why was it taken down?
What if the Earth, as it moves through the galactic environment, went through patches of dark matter or other environmental factors that could alter it? Maybe they all change together. What if these errors are going up together and down together? For more than 10 years, I've been trying to persuade metrologists to look at the raw data. In fact, I'm now trying to persuade them to put it online on the internet.
Remember, this talk was from 10 years ago.
With the dates and the actual measurements, and see if they're correlated, to see if they're all up at one time, all down at another. If so, they might be fluctuating together, and that would tell us something very, very interesting. But no one has done this. They haven't done it because G is a constant. There's no point looking for changes. You see,
is it just ironic that G and God both start with G?
Here's a very simple example of where a dogmatic assumption actually inhibits inquiry. I myself think that the constants may vary quite considerably, well, within narrow limits, but they may all be varying. And
that's his first claim. The constants may vary. That's all he said. But they had to take it down.
I think the day will come when scientific journals like Nature have a weekly report on the constants, like stock market reports in newspapers. You know, this week, big G was slightly up, the charge on the electron was down, the speed of light held steady, and so on.
That'd be pretty cool.
That's one area, just one area where I think thinking less dogmatically could open things up. One of the biggest areas is the nature of the mind. This is the most unsolved problem that science simply can't deal with the fact we're conscious.
And not only that, but there's so many other areas that claim to have the answers.
And it can't deal with the fact that our thoughts don't seem to be inside our brains. Our experiences don't all seem to be inside our brain. Your image of me now doesn't seem to be inside your brain, yet the official view is there's a little Rupert somewhere inside your head, and everything else in this room is inside your head. Your experience is inside your brain.
And that's our best understanding. That is why religious people do not accept that so often. It's because that's not a very complete answer. But that's okay. That's okay. We just have to keep learning, keep following not the science, but the scientific evidence, using science as a method to get the proper evidence that will lead us in the direction of an answer.
I'm suggesting actually that vision involves an outward projection of images. What you're seeing is in your mind, but not inside your head. Our minds are extended beyond our brains in the simplest act of perception. I think that we project out the images we're seeing, and these images touch what we're looking at. If I look at you from behind, you don't know I'm there. Could I affect you? Could you feel my gaze? There's a great deal of evidence that people can. The sense of being stared at is an extremely common experience, and recent experimental research suggests it's real.
I've definitely felt that. You could definitely, maybe you've never experienced it, but you can feel somebody's eyes burning a hole through the back of your neck. I don't know what it is, but it happens.
Animals seem to have it too. I think it probably evolved in the context of predator-prey relationships. Prey animals that could feel the gaze of a predator would survive better than those that couldn't. This would lead to a whole new way of thinking about ecological relationships between predators and prey, also about the extent of our minds. If we look at distant stars, I think our minds reach out in a sense to touch those stars and literally extend out over astronomical different distances. They're not just inside our heads. Now, it may seem astonishing that this is a topic of debate in the 21st century. We know so little about our own minds that where our images are is a hot topic of debate within consciousness studies right now. I don't have time to deal with any more of these dogmas, but every single one of them is questionable. If one questions it, new forms of research, new possibilities open up. And I think as we question these dogmas that have held back science so long, science will undergo a reflowering, a renaissance.
Science will undergo a reflowering, a renaissance. I think we're at a place where we definitely need it, because the fact is, after what we've seen with big pharma over the how many years, and specifically with Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson colluding with the government to do some awful things on very, very little information, I think this reflowering will be quickly upon us. What did you guys think? Thank you so much for partying with me once again. I am your host, Lutch, aka the Indian Jesus, here to resurrect the second coming of common sense. Let me know what you guys thought in the comments below. Until next time, guys, I am out of here. Peace.